Welcome, my friend. Let everything slow. Before he was Godfrey, before the crown and the Erdtree and the Golden Lineage, he was Hoarah Loux, a warrior of the Badlands beyond the lands between. He was the first of all the Elden Lords, the first consort of Queen Marika, the father of a line of demigods, the lord of the battlefield, whose strength shaped the early history of the world. And in the end, he was the first of the Tarnished, cast out from the grace he had won, exiled to die in distant lands. His story runs from the wild Badlands to the Golden Throne and back into exile, a story of strength and glory and loss. Tonight we begin at the beginning, with the wild chieftain before the crown. Tonight we sit with Hoarah Loux, the chieftain of the Badlands, before he became the first Elden Lord. The warrior before the crown. Long before the Golden Order, in the harsh lands beyond the borders of the lands between, there lived a warrior whose strength had no equal among mortals. His name was Hoarah Loux, and he was the chieftain of the Badlands, the leader of a people of warriors in a hard and distant country. He was a being of immense strength, a ferocious and unrelenting fighter, consumed by a hunger for battle that never left him. The Badlands bred hard people, and Hoarah Loux was the hardest of them all, the mightiest warrior of a warrior race, the chieftain whose prowess set him above all the rest. He lived for the fight, for the test of strength against strength, for the clash of war that was the whole meaning of his world. The culture of the Badlands shaped him, and it is worth understanding, because it never wholly left him. The warriors of the Badlands prized strength above all things. They shunned excess adornment, wearing simple headbands that marked the bravest among them, proof that the wearer had slaughtered countless foes. They followed the example of their chieftain, Hoarah Loux, the strongest of them all, honoring strength in battle and the simple hard virtues of a people who lived by war. In the days of the Badlands, a crown was warranted by strength, leadership earned through prowess in battle. The mightiest warrior, the rightful chief. Hoarah Loux was the embodiment of this world. He was no king of ceremony, no lord of courts, but a warrior chieftain, a leader who ruled by being the strongest, whose authority came from his unmatched might. His weapon was the axe, the chosen arm of the Badland chieftains, and his warriors honored him by wielding axes of their own, following their chief into battle after battle. He was a bloodthirsty warrior, the lore says, insatiable in his hunger for combat, the fiercest of a fierce people, the chieftain of the Badlands whose name would one day become legend in a land he had not yet seen. The warriors who followed him were a reflection of the chief, and they matter to his story, for they would follow him through everything that came after. They were the brave warriors of the Badlands, hardened fighters who honored strength above all, who wore the simple headbands of the proven and wielded the axes of their chieftain's example. They followed Hoarah Loux out of respect for his might, the strongest leading the strong, a band of warriors bound by the hard code of their people. When Hoarah Loux was raised to lordship, these warriors would rise with him. When he fell, they would fall with him. And when at last the call came to return, they would return at his side. The chieftain and his warriors were one thing, a brotherhood of the Badlands, bound together through glory and exile alike. There is a purity to this world that stands against the schemes and betrayals of the lands between. In the Badlands, things were simple and hard. Strength ruled, the strongest led, the brave were honored and the weak fell away. There was no golden order here, no grace, no gods looking down. Only the clash of war and the code of warriors who lived by it. Hoarah Loux was the master of this world, the strongest of a strong people, the chieftain whose might was his crown. He had no need of the lands between, no hunger for its golden throne. He was already a king in his own country, the king of the Badlands, warranted by the only thing his people valued, strength. The first of his name. Before we go further, it is worth placing Hoarah Loux in the great story of the lands between, because his importance is hard to overstate. Godfrey, the lord that Hoarah Loux became, was the first Elden Lord of the Golden Order, the first consort of Queen Marika the Eternal, the first of all who would wear that crown. Everything that came after, the whole golden age of Marika's reign, the line of demigods, the order that ruled the lands between, began with him. He was the first husband of the God Queen, the first to stand beside her as Lord, the founder of the Golden Lineage that would shape the world. The kings and demigods who came later, the whole tragic history of the lands between that other tales have followed. All of it traces back to this one warrior, the first Elden Lord, the chieftain of the Badlands raised to the throne, and his blood ran through the great names of the world. From his union with Marika came the first demigods, the Golden Lineage, Godwyn the Golden, the first of the demigods and the first to die, Morgott, the Omen King, who would guard the capital in shame and loyalty, and Mog, the Lord of Blood, who would turn to an outer god and dream of his own dynasty. These were Godfrey's sons, the children of the first Elden Lord and the God Queen, the demigods whose stories run through the whole history of the lands between. The father of this line, the source of the golden blood, was the warrior from the Badlands, Hoarah Loux, whose strength founded a dynasty of gods. There is a sorrow already waiting in this, though it lies far ahead. Two of Godfrey's sons, Morgott and Mog, were born Omen, cursed with horns, deemed shameful by the Golden Order their own father served. They were hidden away, cast into the sewers beneath the capital, treated as a stain on the Golden Lineage. The first Elden Lord, the mighty warrior king, fathered children who were scorned and imprisoned by the very order he had helped to build. And at the very end of his story, in his final return, Godfrey would be found cradling the body of one of these sons, Morgott, the Omen King, mourning the child the golden world had thrown away. The father of the Golden Lineage would close his story grieving over a son that lineage had cursed, the warrior king weeping for the Omen child at the foot of the throne. These threads, the sons and their fates, belong to the parts ahead and to the tales already told of them. For now, it is enough to know that Godfrey stands at the root of the Golden Lineage, the father of demigods, the first lord whose blood and strength founded the dynasty that would rule and ruin the lands between. The warrior from the Badlands became the father of gods, and his children, golden and cursed alike, would carry his blood through the whole long tragedy of the world he helped to build. To know Godfrey, then, is to know the root of almost everything. He is the first lord, the first consort, the father of the lineage, the warrior whose strength began the Golden Age. Other tales have followed his sons, his queen, the order he helped to build, and the catastrophe that ended it. But Godfrey himself, the first of them all, the chieftain raised to lordship and cast down into exile, is the figure at the root of the whole story. The first Elden Lord whose tale we follow tonight, from the wild Badlands to the Golden Throne, and back into the dark. His influence reached even beyond his own blood, into the hearts of those who came after and looked up to him. The mighty Radahn, the Red Lion General, greatest of the demigod warriors, was captivated from his youngest years by the Lord of the Battlefield. Radahn adored Godfrey, modelled himself on the First Elden Lord, adorned himself in the likeness of Godfrey and his beast Regent the Lion, took the Golden Lion as his own symbol in honour of the warrior king he revered. The greatest warrior of the demigod generation shaped himself in the image of the greatest warrior of the first, Radahn, looking back across the ages to Godfrey as the model of what a lord and a fighter should be. The lord of the battlefield was a legend even to the demigods, the warrior king whose example inspired the mightiest of those who came after. This is the measure of Godfrey's place in the world. He was more than the First Elden Lord and the father of the Golden Lineage. He was the model of the warrior king, the standard against which the great fighters of later ages measured themselves, the legend whose strength and glory inspired even the mightiest of the demigods. The Chieftain of the Badlands, raised to lordship, became the founding legend of the lands between, the first, and in some ways the greatest of all its lords, the warrior whose shadow fell across every age that followed his own. The hunger for battle. At the centre of Hoarah Loux's nature was a thing that defined him through all his later life, even when he tried to bury it, an insatiable lust for battle. Hoarah Loux was consumed by a ceaseless hunger for combat, a bloodlust that drove him from fight to fight, a need for the clash of war that could never be wholly satisfied. This was the core of him, the wild and violent heart of the Badland chieftain, the warrior who lived for battle and could not be at peace without it. It made him mighty. It made him the greatest warrior of his people, the chieftain whose strength none could match, and it was a thing that would have to be tamed in time if he was to become the lord he was destined to be. There is something elemental about this hunger, something that sets Hoarah Loux apart from the kings and schemers of the lands between. He did not want power for its own sake, did not scheme for thrones or plot for godhood. He wanted the fight. He wanted to test his strength against the mightiest foes, to stand on the battlefield as the strongest, to live in the clash of war that was the whole meaning of his existence. The hunger for battle was the end itself for Hoarah Loux, never a means to some other end, the thing he lived for, the wild joy at the centre of his warrior's soul. This nature would be both his greatness and his burden. The hunger for battle made him the mightiest warrior the lands between would ever know, worthy of a queen's hand and a god's throne, and it would have to be chained, suppressed, held back, if he was to wear the crown and play the part of a lord. The whole tension of Godfrey's story lies here, in the gap between the wild warrior he was and the dignified lord he would become, between the hunger for battle that was his truest self and the restraint that godhood would demand of him. Tonight he is the chieftain, free and fierce and unchained. What it cost him to become a lord is the story still to come. We will see, in the parts ahead, the strange and poignant way that this hunger was chained. When Hoarah Loux became Godfrey, he took upon his back a great beast, a lion named Serosh, the Lord of Beasts, whose purpose was to suppress his lord's ceaseless lust for battle. The wild warrior, raised to lordship, carried his own restraint upon his shoulders, a beast bound to him to hold back the very nature that had made him great. It is a haunting image, the mightiest warrior in the world carrying a chain upon his back, a living curb on his own wildness, so that he could play the part of a dignified lord. The hunger never left him. It was held down, bound, suppressed, but it remained, waiting beneath the lordly surface for the day it would be unleashed again. And that day would come. At the very end of his story, in his final battle, Godfrey would tear the beast from his back, cast off the restraint of his long lordship, and become Hoarah Loux once more, the wild warrior unchained, the hunger for battle freed at last. The chieftain we meet tonight, free and fierce in the Badlands, is the truest Godfrey, the warrior beneath the Lord, the wild heart that the crown would chain, and that would break its chains again at the end. To understand the First Elden Lord is to understand that beneath the Golden Lord, there was always the Badland chieftain, waiting, the hunger for battle that no crown could ever wholly tame. The mightiest of mortals. What made Hoarah Loux extraordinary, beyond even the warriors of his own hard people, was a strength that approached the divine. Hoarah Loux was the mightiest of all mortals, a warrior whose strength was beyond anything the ordinary world could produce. His power was earth-shaking, his blows capable of flattening foes, his might so great that it would later be measured against the gods themselves. He was, among mortals, without equal, the strongest being who walked the world that was not already a god. And this is what drew the attention that would change his fate. For a strength like his could not stay hidden in the distant Badlands forever. The lore draws a comparison that captures what Hoarah Loux was, likening him to the great heroes of ancient myth, to Heracles above all. Like that hero, Hoarah Loux possessed earth-shattering strength, would endure harsh trials to earn his place among the divine, would slay the mightiest of giants, and carried within him a wildness that could erupt into a berserker fury. He was the mortal hero raised to the threshold of godhood, the strongest of men whose deeds would earn him a place among the gods, a figure of myth made real in the harsh country beyond the lands between. There is a second myth woven into Godfrey, and it casts its shadow forward over his whole story, the legend of Arthur, the once and future king. Like Arthur, Godfrey was a great warrior who presided over a lost golden age, a king of a round table of champions, a lord whose glory faded and who was sent away from his realm. And like Arthur, the king prophesied to return, Godfrey was promised that he would one day come back to reclaim what was lost and stand once more before the throne. The echoes are everywhere. The round table where his Tarnished would later gather, the chief among his crucible knights bearing names of ancient tribes, the golden age that ended in his exile. Godfrey is the once and future king of the lands between, the lord who fell and was promised a return, the warrior king whose story bends toward the day he would come home. It was this strength and this destiny that caught the eye of a god. Queen Marika the Eternal, the god-queen of the lands between, looked out beyond her realm and found, in the distant Badlands, the mightiest and most worthy of all mortals. She would invite him into her realm, raise him to her side, make him the first of her Elden Lords. The wild chieftain of the Badlands, the strongest of mortals, the warrior whose hunger for battle never ceased, was about to be lifted out of his harsh country and into the golden heart of the lands between, to become a lord, a consort, and the father of a line of gods. Tomorrow, we follow Hoarah Loux into the lands between, and watch the wild warrior become the first Elden Lord. Sleep well. Tomorrow the chieftain of the Badlands is summoned by a queen, and takes a name and a burden that will change him forever. A god queen looked out beyond her realm, and found, in the distant Badlands, the mightiest of all mortals. She summoned him, raised him to her side, and made him the first of her Elden Lords. Tonight we follow Hoarah Loux out of the Badlands and into the golden heart of the lands between, and watch the wild warrior take a new name, a new burden, and a beast upon his back to chain the very nature that had made him great. This is the making of Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, and the strange price he paid to wear the crown. Tonight we sit with the crowning of the chieftain and the lion he bound to himself to become a lord. The summons of the queen. The fate of Hoarah Loux changed when a god turned her gaze toward him. Queen Marika the Eternal, the god-queen of the lands between, the vessel of the greater will, and the ruler of the Golden Order, looked out beyond the borders of her realm and found Hoarah Loux in the Badlands. Apparently judging him to be the mightiest and most worthy of all mortals, she invited him into the lands between to serve as her husband. The chieftain of the Badlands, the strongest of mortals, was summoned by a god to be her consort, raised from his harsh distant country to the golden heart of the world, chosen by the Eternal Queen to stand at her side. Consider what this meant, and why Marika chose as she did. The Golden Order needed a lord, a consort to the God Queen, a champion to lead its armies and shape its early conquests. And Marika did not choose a noble of her own realm, a refined lord of the lands between. She reached out beyond her borders to the Badlands and chose the mightiest mortal she could find, the wild warrior chieftain, whose strength surpassed all others. She wanted strength, the raw and unmatched might of the greatest warrior alive, and she found it in Hoarah Loux, the chieftain whose prowess made him worthy, in her eyes, of a god's hand and a lord's crown. The summons was an elevation almost beyond imagining. Hoarah Loux, a mortal of the Badlands, was being raised to stand beside a god, to become the consort of the Eternal Queen, to take his place as the first Elden Lord of the Golden Order. Upon accepting, he would ascend toward godhood himself. The mortal warrior lifted to the threshold of the divine. The wild chieftain of a distant country was about to become one of the most important figures in the history of the lands between. The First Lord, the founding consort, the warrior raised by a god to her own side. There is a question worth holding, one the law would raise again in a later age. Why a warrior, and why this warrior? Marika ruled a realm of refinement and order, a golden civilization of grace and law. And for her first consort, her first lord, she chose a wild warrior from beyond its borders rather than a scholar or a noble of her own world, the fiercest fighter she could find. The choice tells us something about what the early Golden Order needed, and about Marika herself. The young order had wars to wage, enemies to conquer, a world to subdue. It needed a champion, a war leader, a lord whose strength could carry the Golden Order to victory. And so Marika chose strength above all, the mightiest mortal alive, the warrior king whose prowess would win her order its early conquests. The echo comes much later, when Marika chose another champion, Radagon, for her second lord, and the law puzzled over why a mere champion would be raised to the seat of Elden Lord. The pattern was set with Godfrey. Marika chose her lords for their strength, raised warriors and champions to stand beside her, valued might in a consort above blood or refinement. The first Elden Lord was a wild warrior from the Badlands, chosen for his strength, and the choice revealed the heart of what the early Golden Order was, a power that conquered, that needed champions, that raised the mightiest to lordship so that the Order of Gold could be carried across the lands between by the strength of its lords. The taking of the name. When Hoarah Loux accepted the Queen's summons and ascended to lordship, he set aside his old name and took a new one. Upon committing to his role as a lord, Hoarah Loux changed his name to Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. The wild name of the Badland chieftain was set aside, and in its place came the name of a lord of the Golden Order, dignified, kingly, fit for a consort of the eternal queen. The change of name marked the change of being. Hoarah Loux, the warrior, became Godfrey the Lord. The chieftain became the consort. The wild man of the Badlands became the first Elden Lord of the lands between. The name was a new identity, a new role, a new self shaped to fit the golden world he had entered. But the old name was never wholly gone. Hoarah Loux did not cease to exist when Godfrey was crowned. He was buried, suppressed, held beneath the dignified surface of the Lord, but he remained, the wild warrior beneath the golden crown. The two names are the two halves of the same being. Godfrey, the Lord that the Badland chieftain became to serve the Golden Order, and Hoarah Loux, the wild warrior that Godfrey always was beneath the crown. To take the name Godfrey was to put on a role, a self crafted for lordship, while the true name and the true self waited underneath. This doubling runs through the whole of his story, and it gives him his particular tragedy. Godfrey is a persona, a self created to appear more dignified, more kingly, more civilized, fit for the role of a lord in the Golden Order. And beneath it lies Hoarah Loux, the warrior, the wild heart, the truest self. The first Elden Lord was a man wearing the mask of a lord over the face of a warrior, playing the part of a civilized king, while the wild chieftain waited beneath. The taking of the name Godfrey was the beginning of a long suppression. The wild self chained so that the lordly self could rule, the warrior hidden so that the lord could serve. It is worth pausing on what kind of tragedy this is, because it is a quieter one than the betrayals and murders that fill the rest of the lands between. Godfrey was not corrupted, not driven mad, not turned to evil. His tragedy was subtler. He gave up the fullness of himself, suppressed his own nature, became less than he was, all in the service of a role and an order. He chose to chain his wild heart so that he could be a lord, to wear a mask over his truest face, to live as a suppressed and dignified version of the warrior he was born to be. There is a sadness in this that has nothing to do with villainy. The sadness of a great being made smaller by the role he agreed to play, the warrior who buried himself to wear a crown. And the deepest note of it is that he did this willingly, out of a kind of devotion. Godfrey accepted the crown, took the name, bound the beast, made the vow, suppressed his nature, all because he had committed to the role of a lord, to the service of Marika and her order. He was loyal, faithful to the part he had agreed to play, willing to diminish himself for the sake of the order he served. The first Elden Lord chained his own wild heart because he had given his word, not because he was forced to it, and he kept that word through the whole of his lordship, suppressing the warrior so that the Lord could serve, faithful to a vow that cost him the fullness of himself. Mabrus, the beast upon his back, to hold down the wild nature that the name alone could not contain. Godfrey took upon himself a stranger and more haunting burden, a beast bound to his back. Godfrey took the beast regent Serosh upon his back, a great lion, the lord of beasts, whose purpose was to suppress his lord's ceaseless lust for battle. The lion rode upon Godfrey's shoulders, bound to him, a living chain upon the warrior's wild nature. Through Serosh, Godfrey was able to hold back his bloodlust, to act as a lord should act, to conform to the dignified culture of Marika's Golden Order, rather than giving in to the hunger for battle that was his truest self. The beast was the curb, the restraint, the thing that made it possible for the wild chieftain to play the part of a civilized lord. It is one of the most haunting images in all of Elden Ring. The mightiest warrior in the world carrying a beast upon his back to chain his own nature. Godfrey did not master his bloodlust through will alone. He needed Serosh, needed the lion bound to his shoulders, needed an external thing to hold down the wildness within him. The strongest mortal who ever lived, the warrior whose hunger for battle made him great, could rule as a lord only by carrying his own restraint upon his back, a living weight that suppressed the very thing that made him who he was. The crown sat on his head, but the chain sat on his shoulders, and the two together made Godfrey the Lord. There is a poignancy in this that deepens the more one considers it. Serosh did not make Godfrey stronger. The law is clear that the suppression weakened him, that holding back his bloodlust and his warrior instincts made him less than his full self. To be a lord, Godfrey had to be less than the warrior he was born to be, had to carry a beast that diminished him, had to chain the wildness that was the source of his might. The price of the crown was the suppression of his truest self, the binding of the warrior so that the lord could rule. Godfrey gave up the fullness of his own strength to wear the crown, carrying upon his back the beast that made him a lord by making him less than Hoarah Loux. Serosh was more than a chain upon Godfrey, though. The lion, the lord of beasts, became a guiding presence to the whole Golden Lineage, counseling the descendants of Godfrey and Marika, the demigods of the Golden Line. The beast that suppressed the First Elden Lord's bloodlust became a counselor to his children, a presence woven through the dynasty he founded. And Serosh's image became a relic of past glory, etched in golden armor, a symbol of the Lord and his beast that endured long after Godfrey's fall. The young Raidan, captivated by the Lord of the battlefield, adorned himself in the likeness of Serosh and his king, taking the golden lion as his own emblem in honor of the warrior king and the beast he bore. The lion upon Godfrey's back became a symbol of the whole Golden Age, the emblem of the First Lord and the dynasty that sprang from him. The binding of Serosh to Godfrey echoes another binding in the deep lore of the lands between, one that came much later. When Miquella sought to raise his consort, he attached himself to the resurrected Radagon in a manner that mirrors how Serosh was anchored to Godfrey, the two bindings paralleling each other across the ages, twin images of a being bound to another to shape or restrain its nature. The lion upon the Lord's back and the godchild upon the consort's body are echoes of one another, the deep patterns of the lands between repeating across the generations. Godfrey, bearing Serosh, stands at the origin of this pattern, the first of the great bindings, the warrior king carrying upon his back the beast that chained him into a lord. The ascent to godhood. There is more to Godfrey's elevation than a crown and a marriage, for to become an Elden Lord was to step toward the divine. When Hoarah Loux accepted Marika's summons and became the first Elden Lord, he ascended toward godhood himself. The consort of the Eternal Queen was no mere mortal husband. He was raised toward the divine, lifted from the ranks of mortals to stand beside a god as something more than a man. The law speaks of him enduring harsh trials to earn his godhood, the mortal warrior proving himself worthy of the divine through ordeal and strength, much as the heroes of ancient myth earned their places among the gods. Hoarah Loux did more than marry a queen. He climbed toward divinity, the mightiest of mortals raised toward the company of gods. This ascent connects Godfrey to the deep pattern of the lands between, where mortals and gods are not always separate things. Marika herself had been raised to godhood, an Empyrean who ascended to become the vessel of the greater will. Godfrey, her consort, climbed a path of his own toward the divine, the warrior earning through strength and trial a place beside the God Queen. The first Elden Lord was a being between worlds, a mortal raised toward godhood, a warrior who had climbed from the Badlands to the threshold of the divine, neither wholly a man any longer nor wholly a god, but something raised between the two by the hand of the eternal queen. And yet, for all his elevation, Godfrey remained, at his core, the warrior he had always been. The ascent to godhood did not erase Hoarah Loux. It raised him, crowned him, lifted him toward the divine. But beneath the godhood and the lordship, the wild chieftain endured, the hunger for battle still burning. Godfrey ascended toward the company of gods, while carrying within him the wild heart of the Badlands, a god-lord with a warrior's soul, raised to divinity, but never ceasing to be the fierce chieftain who had won his place through strength. The elevation was real, and so was the wildness it could not erase. The two held together in the strange being who was the first Elden Lord. The vow of the Lord, the taking of the name and the binding of the beast were both expressions of a single thing, a vow. Godfrey's twin-headed axe, the weapon he bore as Elden Lord, was born of a vow of restraint, a vow to conduct himself as a lord. When the wild chieftain became the first Elden Lord, he made a vow to set aside his wild nature, to rule as a lord should rule, to serve the Golden Order and the Eternal Queen with dignity, rather than with the unchained fury of the Badlands. The axe, the name, the beast upon his back, all were symbols of this vow. The warriors promised to be a lord, to suppress the hunger for battle, and play the part the crown demanded. This vow became the emblem of his whole line. Godfrey's twin-headed axe, born of his vow of restraint, became the enduring symbol of his lineage and their conquest across the lands between, an emblem of the golden line that sprang from him. The vow of the first Elden Lord, his promise to conduct himself as a lord rather than a wild warrior, was passed down as the founding principle of the Golden Lineage, the mark of the dynasty he founded. What began as one warrior's vow to chain his own nature became the symbol of a whole bloodline, the Golden Lineage marked from its founding by the restraint of its founder. And yet the vow, like the name and the beast, was a suppression rather than a transformation. Godfrey vowed to conduct himself as a lord, but he did not cease to be Hoarah Loux. The vow held the warrior down. It did not erase him. Beneath the lord who kept his vow, the wild chieftain waited, the hunger for battle suppressed, but never gone. The vow of restraint was a lid upon a fire, holding it down, keeping it from breaking out, but the fire still burned beneath, waiting for the day the vow would be cast aside and the warrior freed. Godfrey kept his vow for the whole of his lordship, ruling as a lord, suppressing his nature, carrying his beast, and at the very end, in his final battle, he would break it, tearing the beast from his back and becoming Hoarah Loux once more, the warrior unchained, the vow undone at last. Sleep well. Tomorrow we follow the first Elden Lord to war, into the great campaign against the giants that would birth the Erdtree itself. The first great deed of the first Elden Lord was a war, and it was a war that shaped the whole world to come. Before the Erdtree could rise, before the Golden Order could begin in earnest, a threat had to be removed. The fire giants and their flame of ruin, the one fire capable of burning the golden tree. And so Marika sent her lord and her armies into the frozen mountaintops to put the giants to the sword. Tonight we follow Godfrey into the war against the giants, the campaign that birthed the Erdtree, the deed that earned him his name as the Lord of the battlefield. Tonight we sit with the war that made the world, the first Elden Lord and his golden armies in the mountains of the giants. The threat to the Erdtree, Before the Golden Age could begin, there stood in its way an ancient power that had to be broken. In the days before the Erdtree, everything stood in opposition to it. The Erdtree was not yet the unchallenged heart of the world. It was a burgeoning thing, a young and growing tree, and around it were powers that threatened its rise. The greatest of these threats came from the mountaintops of the giants, the frozen domain in the far northeast of the lands between, where the fire giants dwelt. The giants worshipped a fell god, a one-eyed deity whose power was the flame of ruin, a fire of terrible destructive force, and this fire was the one thing in all the world that could burn the Erdtree. This made the fire giants and their flame of ruin the single greatest threat to Marika's order. The Erdtree was to be the heart of the Golden Order, the seat of Marika's power, the embodiment of the order she meant to build. And so long as the flame of ruin existed, that order was in peril, for the fire of the giants could burn the golden tree to ash. Before the age of the Erdtree could begin in earnest, the flame of ruin had to be neutralized, the fire giants broken, their terrible fire confined so that it could never be turned against the tree. The whole future of the Golden Order depended on the breaking of the giants, and so Marika turned to her lord. She had chosen Godfrey for his strength, the mightiest mortal she could find, and now that strength would be put to its first great purpose. Marika and her consort Godfrey marched upon the mountaintops of the giants, leading the golden armies of the young order into the frozen north to break the fire giants and confine their flame. The first great war of the Golden Order was about to begin, and at its head rode the First Elden Lord, the warrior king, whose strength would carry the order to its first and most important victory. There is a fittingness in this being Godfrey's first deed, and it tells us why Marika had chosen as she did. She needed strength, a champion who could break the mightiest foes, a war leader who could carry her order to victory against powers that were practically gods. And in Godfrey, she had found just that, the mightiest mortal alive, the warrior whose strength could shatter even the fire giants. The choice of a wild warrior from the Badlands as her first lord was vindicated in this war, for it was his untamed strength, his prowess in battle, his might against the mightiest, that the breaking of the giants required. Marika had chosen a warrior, and now the warrior would prove why she had chosen him. The fire giants were no ordinary foe. They were the children of a fell god, towering beings of immense power, wielders of a flame that could burn the very heart of the Golden Order. To march against them was to march against something close to the divine, to wage war on a people whose god still smouldered in their fire. One who fought such foes, the law suggests, fought beings that were practically gods, the mightiest of the giants worthy of comparison to Radagon, or to Marika herself. And Godfrey marched against them at the head of his armies, the warrior king leading the golden host into a war against the children of a god, the first and greatest test of the strength that had made him the First Elden Lord. The march into the mountains, the war against the giants, was no easy campaign, and the path to the giants' domain was long and hard. The golden armies, led by Godfrey, left the Altus Plateau and climbed into the mountaintops of the giants, the frozen peaks where the fire giants dwelt. They carved winding paths through the mountains, fighting their way toward the higher summits where the giants made their home. The giants were mighty foes, towering beings of immense strength who wielded the flame of ruin, and they did not fall easily. They used their bellowing roars to trigger avalanches, bringing the mountains down upon their attackers, fighting with all the fury of a doomed people defending their ancient home. Godfrey did not fight alone. His golden armies were joined by allies drawn from the giants' own lands, peoples who had their own reasons to war against the fire giants. The Knights of Zama, who had been the historical and mortal enemies of the fire giants since time immemorial, joined the campaign, lending the power of their ice storms to the war against the masters of flame. The fire monks devised an incantation that could protect the warriors from the giants' fire, a faith-born shield against the flame of ruin. And even the trolls, the descendants of the giants themselves, betrayed their ancestors and switched sides, fighting on behalf of the Erdtree, furnished with gilded swords to mark their fealty. At the head of this host rode Godfrey, the lord of the battlefield, and his finest warriors, the Crucible Knights. These were the elite knights who served the First Elden Lord, warriors who wielded the power of the Crucible, the primordial form of the Erdtree. Their commander was the Knight Ordovis, who, with his fellow Crucible Knight Siluria, led the knights into the war. They honored their master Godfrey by wearing the crest of the axe, the symbol of the First Elden Lord, the mark of the warrior king they served. The Crucible Knights were the spearhead of Godfrey's army, the elite warriors who carried the war into the heart of the giants' domain. The alliance of so many peoples against the giants tells us how great the threat was and how the war was waged. The Knights of Zama with their ice storms, the fire monks with their protective incantations, the trolls who turned against their own ancestors, the Crucible Knights with their primordial power, all gathered under the banner of Godfrey and the Erdtree. It was a coalition drawn from the giants' own lands and beyond, a host of allies bound together by the war against the fire giants and their flame. And at its head, uniting and leading them all, rode the First Elden Lord, the warrior king whose strength was the heart of the host, the lord of the battlefield, carrying a war of many peoples toward the forge of the giants, where the flame of ruin burned. The Knights of the Crucible, the warriors who served Godfrey in this war, deserve a closer look, for they carried a power as old as the world itself. The Crucible Knights were the elite warriors of the First Elden Lord, and their strength came from the Crucible, the primordial form of life from which the Erdtree itself had grown. The Crucible was the original wellspring of life in the lands between, the molten source from which all living things had once emerged, holding within it the mingled aspects of every kind of life. Horns and tails, wings and scales, the raw and untamed forms of the primordial world. The Crucible Knights wielded this ancient power, calling forth its aspects in battle, tails and horns of force erupting from their bodies. The old wild power of the Crucible made into weapons of war. There is a fitting symmetry in Godfrey commanding these knights. Godfrey was himself a wild thing, a warrior of untamed strength, a being whose truest nature was fierce and primal, and the Crucible was the wild primal source of all life, the untamed wellspring before the order of the Erdtree refined and tamed it. The wild lord and the wild power belonged together, the warrior king of the Badlands commanding the knights who wielded the primordial force of life itself. Godfrey, the untamed warrior chained into a lord, led the knights of the untamed Crucible, a fitting pairing of wild strength and primal power in the service of the young Golden Order. The chief of these knights was Ordovis, who, with Siluria, commanded the Crucible Knights under Godfrey. They honored their lord by wearing the crest of the axe, the symbol of Godfrey, marking themselves as the warriors of the First Elden Lord. Long after Godfrey's fall, the Crucible Knights would endure, some of them keeping their ancient vigil over the tombs and relics of the age of Godfrey, the last warriors of a vanished golden age. They were the elite of the First Elden Lord's army, the wielders of the primordial power, the knights who carried the wild force of the Crucible into the war that birthed the Erdtree. And in time, the Crucible itself would come to be seen as something shameful by the refined Golden Order, its wild aspects, the horns and tails, deemed impure, the primal power of the knights who served Godfrey, slowly pushed to the margins of the order they had helped to found. The breaking of the giants. The war reached its climax in a slaughter that broke the fire giants forever. After traversing the great frozen lake of the mountain tops, the golden armies drew close to the forge of the giants, the heart of the giants' power, where the flame of ruin burned. There Marika issued her proclamation to Godfrey and his warriors, commanding them to put the giants to the sword and confine their flame, so that the age of the Erdtree could begin. The words have come down through the ages: put the giants to the sword and confine the flame atop the mount. Let a new epoch begin, an epoch glistening with life. The order was given, and Godfrey carried it out. Despite the initial odds, the champions of the Erdtree prevailed. The fire giants were massacred in the fields before their forge, their corpses left impaled and frozen across the battlefield, the briars of the Erdtree bursting through their fallen bodies. Godfrey himself slew the mightiest of the giants, the lord of the battlefield, cutting down the greatest of the fell god's children, proving his strength against foes that were practically gods. The giants, for all their power, for all their flame and fury, were broken before the golden armies of the First Elden Lord, their ancient domain reduced to a frozen graveyard of impaled corpses. But the flame of ruin could not be wholly extinguished. For all their victory, the champions of the Erdtree could not put out the giants' fire. And so, Marika took another course. She confined the flame, sealed it atop the mountain, and cursed the last surviving fire giant to tend it for all eternity, a solitary keeper bound to watch over the fire that could never be allowed to spread. The flame of ruin was imprisoned rather than destroyed, held atop the highest peak, guarded by a cursed giant condemned to an eternity of lonely vigil over the fire his people had worshipped. The threat to the Erdtree was contained, the flames sealed away, the giants broken, their fire held forever atop the frozen mount. The birth of the Erdtree. With the giants broken and their flame confined, the way was clear at last for the age that Godfrey's war had made possible. The end of the war marked the dawn of the era of the Erdtree, the age of the Golden Order, presided over by Queen Marika and her Elden Lord. The defeat of the giants and the confinement of the flame of ruin removed the last great threat to the Golden Tree, and the Erdtree could now rise unchallenged as the heart of the world. This war heralded the birth of the Erdtree, the lore tells us, the beginning of an age of order ruled over by Marika and Godfrey. The Golden Age that other tales have followed, the whole reign of the Golden Order, began here, in the victory of the First Elden Lord over the giants. It is worth marking what Godfrey's war made possible, and what it foreshadowed. The age of the Erdtree, the golden age of plenty, the reign of Marika and her order, all of it rested on the foundation of this first war. The breaking of the giants that cleared the way for the tree to rise. Godfrey, the lord of the battlefield, was the warrior whose strength founded the Golden Age, the lord whose first great deed made the whole order possible. The age of the Erdtree began amidst conflict, born of war, founded on the slaughter of the giants, and the warrior who won that war was the First Elden Lord. This is where Godfrey earned the title that would define him, the Lord of the Battlefield. He was the warrior king whose place was the field of war. whose greatness was proven in battle, whose strength founded the Golden Age through conquest. The age of the Erdtree began amidst conflict, and Godfrey was his champion, the lord of the battlefield, who won the Order its first and most important victory. The title captures what he was, a lord of war more than a lord of courts or councils, a king whose throne was the battlefield and whose crown was won through strength. Through the war against the giants and the many battles that followed, Godfrey made himself the lord of the battlefield, the warrior king who carried the Golden Order to victory. And the Golden Age his war made possible was, at its dawn, a time of wonder. The Erdtree rose unchallenged, its blessed sap dripping from its boughs, an age of plenty glistening with life, just as Marika's proclamation had promised. The era that Godfrey's war had birthed was, in its beginning, a golden age in the truest sense, a time of order and abundance and life under the reign of Marika and her lord of the battlefield. That this age would later curdle, that the Erdtree would become an object of grim faith rather than wonder, that the Order would harden into cruelty, lay far ahead. At its birth, the age of the Erdtree was a thing of glory, and the warrior who had made it possible stood at its dawn as the first and greatest of its lords. And there is a shadow in it, one that would not be felt until the very end of the world story. The flame of ruin was sealed, not destroyed, held atop the mountain by a cursed giant. And the burning of the Erdtree, should that flame ever be loosed against it, was named the first cardinal sin, the gravest of all crimes against the Golden Order. Prophets would glimpse the flame of ruin in their visions, foreseeing the day it would burst forth and bring the Order to ash, and they would be banished for their dark prophecies. The fire that Godfrey's war had confined waited atop the mountain, sealed but not gone, a threat held in check for an age, until the day a Tarnished and a maiden would climb the peak, defeat the cursed giant, and loose the flame of ruin upon the Erdtree at last. The war that birthed the Golden Age also sealed the fire that would one day end it. Sleep well. Tomorrow we turn to the Golden Lineage, the children of Godfrey and Marika, the first demigods and the family that would carry the First Lord's blood through the whole history of the world. From the union of the First Elden Lord and the Eternal Queen sprang a line of demigods, the Golden Lineage, the founding bloodline of the lands between. Godfrey was the father of this line, the source of its golden blood, the warrior whose strength founded a dynasty of gods. And his children were among the great names of the world, the golden sun who was beloved, the cursed twins cast into the dark, the descendants who would carry his blood through the whole long tragedy of the world. Tonight we sit with Godfrey as a father, with the lineage he founded, and with the children who carried his blood, golden and cursed alike. Tonight we sit with the Golden Lineage, the children of the First Elden Lord, and the blood that founded a world. The founding of the line. Godfrey and his offspring with Queen Marika became the first demigods, the founders of the bloodline that would rule the lands between. They were called the Golden Lineage, the first demigods, the children of the union between the First Elden Lord and the Eternal Queen. From Godfrey's strength and Marika's divinity came a line of beings who were more than mortal, demigods who carried the blood of a god-queen and the might of the strongest warrior who ever lived. This was the founding bloodline of the Golden Order, the royal line of the lands between, the dynasty that would shape the whole history of the world. And at its head, as its father and founder, stood Godfrey, the warrior from the Badlands whose blood began the line of gods. it is worth pausing on what it meant to be the father of the first demigods. The demigods were the great powers of the lands between, the children of Marika, who would inherit her order and her world, the children of Godfrey, the children of Radagon, the whole generation of god-touched beings who would rule and ruin the realm. And Godfrey was the father of the first of them, the founder of the demigod line, the mortal whose strength mingled with the god queen's divinity to produce the first beings of more than mortal blood. Through him, the strength of the Badlands entered the bloodline of the gods, the might of the mightiest mortal woven into the demigod line that would shape the lands between. This was a strange elevation for a warrior of the Badlands. Hoarah Loux had been a mortal chieftain, the leader of a hard people in a distant land, and he became the father of gods, the founder of a line of demigods, the source of a bloodline that carried divine power. The wild warrior of the Badlands, raised to lordship and godhood, became the patriarch of the Golden Lineage, his mortal strength transformed, through his union with the God Queen, into the founding blood of a dynasty of demigods. The chieftain became a father of gods, his blood the root of the golden line. The emblem of this lineage was the lion, Serosh, the beast Godfrey bore upon his back. Serosh's image became the symbol of the Golden Lineage, a mark of the founding dynasty, and the lion himself acted as a counselor and guide to Godfrey's descendants, the beast who had tamed the First Lord becoming a guiding presence to the whole line that sprang from him. The lion that chained Godfrey's wildness became the guardian spirit of his children, the emblem of the golden blood, the counselor of the dynasty. Through Serosh, the legacy of the First Elden Lord was carried into his lineage, the beast and the bloodline bound together across the generations. And the symbol of Godfrey's vow, his great twin-headed axe, became the emblem of his line as well. The axe that marked the warrior's vow to conduct himself as a lord became a symbol of the Golden Lineage and their conquest across the lands between, the mark of the dynasty Godfrey founded. The vow of the First Lord, his promise of restraint, was passed down as the founding principle of his bloodline, the Golden Lineage carrying the emblem of their founder's vow through the ages. The lion and the axe, the restraint and the strength, the beast and the vow, became the marks of the Golden Lineage, the legacy of the First Elden Lord woven into the dynasty he founded. The Golden Sun. The first and most beloved of Godfrey's children was a son who seemed, for a time, to be everything the Golden Age could produce. Godwyn, called the Golden, was the eldest son of Godfrey and Marika, and the only one of Marika's children who was not born cursed, where his half-siblings would carry afflictions, the rot and the eternal youth and the curse of the omen. Godwyn was born whole and golden and beloved, the golden child of the Golden Age. He was a fierce warrior, capable of battling the ancient dragons themselves, and he took the initiative in forging an alliance between the Golden Order and the dragons, a peace that Marika herself approved. Godwyn the Golden was the shining sun, the beloved firstborn, the very image of what the Golden Lineage was meant to be. Godwyn was beloved above all the other children, even by Marika, who showed him a tenderness she showed to few others. He was the golden child, the bright hope of the lineage, the son in whom the promise of the Golden Age seemed to live, and his fate would prove to be one of the great hinges of the world's history. For Godwyn was the first of the demigods to die, slain in the night of the Black Knives, his soul killed by a stolen fragment of the rune of death, while his body lived on, a death of the soul that was unlike any the Golden Order allowed. The murder of the beloved Golden Sun would drive Marika to the brink, and may have been the very thing that led her to shatter the Elden Ring and end the Golden Age. There is a sorrow in this for Godfrey, though the lore leaves it mostly unspoken. His golden son, his beloved firstborn, the bright hope of his lineage, was murdered, his soul slain in the dark. By the time of Godwyn's death, Godfrey had already been exiled from the lands between, cast out into the Badlands. He was not there to protect his son, not there when the Black Knives came, not there to mourn the golden child, whose death would help to bring down the whole Golden Age. The father of the Golden Lineage was far away in exile, when its brightest son was murdered, the first of his children to fall, the golden son lost while his father walked the distant Badlands. The death of Godwyn was a wound in the world, not only in the family. He was the first demigod to die, and his death was a strange and terrible thing. His soul was slain while his body lived on, a death of the soul that the Golden Order, which had banished death itself, had no place for. The murdered golden son became something monstrous in his death, his soulless body rooting beneath the earth, spreading the death blight that would creep through the lands between. The beloved firstborn, the shining hope of the lineage, became in death the seed of a horror that spread through the world. The golden sun turned into a wellspring of death by the black knives that slew his soul, and his death broke the heart of the God Queen. Marika, who had loved Godwyn above all her other children, was driven to the brink by his murder. The killing of the golden sun may have been the very thing that pushed her to shatter the Elden Ring, to break the order she had built, to end the Golden Age in a single act of grief and rage. The death of Godfrey's beloved firstborn, the golden son he was not there to protect, became one of the hinges on which the whole tragedy of the lands between turned. The murder that may have driven the God Queen to shatter the world. The golden son's death was the beginning of the end of the Golden Age his father had founded. The Cursed Twins. Two more of Godfrey's sons were born to a crueler fate than Godwyn, marked from birth by a curse that the Golden Order despised. Morgott and Mog, the twin sons of Godfrey and Marika, were born omen, cursed with horns that grew from their bodies, an affliction that the Golden Order deemed shameful and impure. The omen were despised in the world that Marika and Godfrey had built, their horns seen as a stain, a curse, a thing to be hidden away. And so, the twin sons of the First Elden Lord were cast into the subterranean shunning grounds, the sewers beneath the capital, hidden from the golden world above, treated as a shame upon the lineage that had produced them. The children of the First Lord and the God Queen were thrown into the dark, cursed and shunned by the very order their father had helped to build. There is a cruel irony in why the twins may have been cursed, one that reaches back into Marika's own hidden past. The horns of the omen resembled those of the Hornsent, the people of the realm of shadow, who had once been Marika's own kind, and whom she had betrayed and destroyed in her rise to godhood. The omen children may have been a reminder of that buried sin, the horns of Marika's own origins surfacing in her children, a curse that sprang from the mother's hidden past rather than from anything in Godfrey. The twins were cursed, the lore suggests, by something in Marika's bloodline, the shadow of the horn scent she had betrayed surfacing in the horns of her own sons. The twins met their shared curse in very different ways, and their paths would diverge across the whole history of the world. Morgott, despite being cast into the sewers, remained loyal to the Golden Order, growing up to become the secret guardian of the capital, defending the Order that had shunned him out of a love that the Order never returned. Mog, the other twin, turned away from the order that had rejected him, giving his allegiance to an outer god, the formless mother, embracing the blood and dreaming of his own dynasty. The two cursed sons of Godfrey, born to the same shame, chose opposite roads. One loyal to the order that scorned him, one turned to a god of blood, the twin children of the First Lord carrying their shared curse toward very different ends. It is worth marking that the curse the twins bore came from no fault of their father. Godfrey was a warrior of the Badlands, not a being of horns or shadow, and the omen affliction did not spring from his blood. The horns came from somewhere in Marika's hidden lineage, from the buried Hornsent past of the God Queen, surfacing in her children as a curse that the order she ruled would despise. Godfrey's sons were cursed by their mother's hidden origins, not by anything in their father, the warrior whose blood gave them strength rather than the affliction that doomed them. The First Elden Lord fathered cursed children through no curse of his own, the shame that fell on Morgoth and Mog, rising from the shadowed past of the Queen, rather than the warrior. The fading of the blood. The Golden Lineage that Godfrey founded did not endure in its glory. Across the generations, the golden blood thinned and faded, until its last heirs were a sad shadow of the mighty founder. The line ran on past Godfrey's own children. Godwyn the Golden, before his death, left descendants who carried the golden blood, and through them the lineage continued, though ever more diluted. The most notable of these later heirs was Godric, called the Grafted, the last of the Golden Lineage, a distant descendant of Godfrey and Marika. And Godric was a feeble thing, a far cry from the mighty founder of his line. His divine blood was so diluted, so thinned by the generations, that he was deemed the weakest of his kin, a wretched lord clinging to a fragment of the golden inheritance. The contrast between Godfrey and Godric measures the whole decline of the lineage. Godfrey was the mightiest mortal who ever lived, the warrior who broke the giants, the lord of the battlefield, the founder of the Golden Line. Godric was a feeble, desperate lord who grafted the limbs of the dead onto his own body in a pathetic attempt to claim a strength he did not have. Weeping for the golden home his diluted blood could barely connect him to. The line that began with the strongest of all mortals ended in a wretch grafting corpses to himself. The golden blood faded almost to nothing. The mighty inheritance of Godfrey dwindled to the desperate clutching of its last feeble heir. There is a sorrow in this decline that touches the whole story of the Golden Age. Godfrey founded a line of demigods, a golden lineage meant to rule the lands between in glory, and that line faded, thinned, decayed, until its last heirs were cursed, omen cast into sewers, murdered golden sons, and feeble grafted wretches clinging to a fragment of lost glory. The golden age that Godfrey's strength had founded curdled and declined, and the lineage declined with it, the mighty blood of the First Elden Lord fading across the generations into the wretched remnants that the Tarnished would face in the broken lands between. The founder was a god among mortals. His heirs were a tragedy. The father and his sons. There is a question worth sitting with before we leave the lineage. What did Godfrey feel for the children the Golden Order cursed? The lore gives one haunting answer at the very end of Godfrey's story. When the First Elden Lord returned to the lands between in his final days, he was found at the foot of the Elden Throne cradling the body of his son, Morgoth, the Omen King, whom the Tarnished had slain. The mighty warrior, the lord of the battlefield, was discovered mourning his cursed son, holding the body of the Omen child as it dissipated into golden dust. This single image tells us much. that Godfrey loved his sons, even the cursed ones, even the omen twins the Golden Order had thrown away. The father grieved for the shunned son, the warrior king weeping over the omen child at the foot of the throne. It suggests that Godfrey, whatever the order decreed, did not share its contempt for his cursed children. Morgoth had been cast into the sewers, shunned and hidden, deemed a shame upon the lineage, and yet his father, at the end, mourned him, cradled his body, grieved for the son the order had thrown away. The bond between Godfrey and Morgoth seems to have been real, a father's love for a son that the cruelty of the Golden Order could not erase. The First Elden Lord, the founder of the order that cursed the omen, loved his omen son and grieved for him at the last. And there is one more child of Godfrey, born of the Badlands rather than of Marika, who carries his blood in a different line. Hoarah Loux, a warrior who shares Godfrey's old name of Hoarah Loux, is his daughter or close descendant, born of his time in the Badlands rather than his union with the Queen. She is a warrior of the Badlands, of the proper lineage, an heir to Hoarah Loux through the line he founded in exile, rather than the golden line he founded in the lands between. Through Nepheli, the blood of the First Elden Lord runs in a second stream, the warrior's line of the Badlands, separate from the cursed and golden demigods, carrying the strength of Hoarah Loux into a different inheritance. The father of the Golden Lineage was also the father of a warrior's line, his blood running in two streams, the golden demigods of the lands between, and the warriors of the distant Badlands. Sleep well. Tomorrow we follow Godfrey through his many conquests, the battles, and the long march that made him the lord of the battlefield, and the moment his last enemy fell. The war against the giants was only the beginning. Across the long years of his lordship, Godfrey fought battle after battle, conquest after conquest, carving out the dominion of the Golden Order with the strength of his arm. He was the lord of the battlefield, the warrior king whose place was the field of war, and he led his golden armies through campaigns that subdued the lands between. Tonight, we follow Godfrey through his conquests, the duels and the sieges and the long march, and we come to a quiet and terrible moment, the day his last worthy enemy fell, and the light in his eyes began to fade. Tonight we sit with the conquests of the First Elden Lord, and the strange sorrow that waited at the end of all his victories. The Lord of the Battlefield. The age of the Erdtree began amidst conflict, and Godfrey was its champion, the warrior whose whole nature was the field of war. As the Lord of the Battlefield, Godfrey fought in many battles, leading the golden armies of the Golden Order through campaign after campaign across the lands between. He was the war leader of the young order, the lord whose strength carried it to victory after victory, the warrior king whose conquest built the dominion of the Erdtree. Where other lords might rule from thrones and councils, Godfrey ruled from the battlefield, his place always at the head of his armies, his greatness proven in the clash of war. The title he bore captured the truth of him, the lord of the battlefield, the king whose throne was the field of war. This was the role that suited his nature, even chained as it was. Godfrey carried within him the hunger for battle, the wild warrior's lust for combat that Serosh held down but never erased. And as the lord of the battlefield, that hunger had its outlet. The wars of the Golden Order gave Godfrey battle after battle, foe after foe, conquest after conquest, the chained warrior finding in the Order's campaigns the combat his nature craved. For all that he was bound, for all that he played the Lord, Godfrey was still a warrior at heart, and the long years of conquest let that warrior fight, even beneath the restraint of the crown and the beast. There is a fittingness in this that runs through his whole story. Marika had chosen a warrior for her lord, the mightiest mortal she could find, and she had set him to the work that warriors do, the waging of war, the breaking of enemies, the conquest of a realm. Godfrey served the Golden Order best by being what he was, a warrior, the strongest who ever lived, leading its armies to victory. The Lord of the Battlefield was the wild chieftain of the Badlands, put to the purpose of an order, his strength harnessed to conquest, his hunger for battle channeled into the building of a golden dominion. He was made for war, and war was what the Order needed, and so the First Elden Lord spent his lordship in the place he belonged, the battlefield. And yet there is a quiet tragedy already forming in this arrangement, one that the fading of his eyes would reveal. Godfrey's purpose in the Golden Order was to conquer, to win its wars, to break its enemies. But conquest has an end. A warrior set to win wars will, if he is mighty enough, win them all, and then his purpose is spent. Godfrey was the mightiest warrior who ever lived, and so the day would come when he had won every war the Order needed won, broken every enemy it needed broken, and stood victorious with nothing left to do. The role of the Lord of the Battlefield carried within it the seed of its own ending, for a battlefield lord who conquers everything is left, at the last, with no battlefield at all. The Order had use for Godfrey only so long as there were enemies to break. His whole value to the Golden Order was his strength in war, his power to conquer, his might against its foes. And when the foes were all defeated, when the conquests were all complete, the Order's need for him ended. The warrior who had won everything became, in his very victory, a lord without a purpose, a lord of the battlefield, with no more battles to fight. The completeness of his service was the beginning of his expendability. The conqueror who had conquered himself out of his usefulness to the Order he served. What came of that, when the Order found it no longer needed its warrior lord, is the heart of the turn his story was about to take. The duel with the Storm Lord. Among the many battles of Godfrey's conquests, one stands out as a mark of his strength, his duel with the Storm Lord. Godfrey faced the Storm Lord alone in single combat and emerged the victor. The Storm Lord was the master of Stormvale, the great fortress that commands the cliffs of Limgrave, and Godfrey challenged him one against one, warrior against warrior, in the old way of the Badlands where strength alone decided who should rule. He bested the Storm Lord in their duel, and by that victory became the new Lord of Stormvale, claiming the fortress and its dominion through the strength of his arm. The duel was a thing of the old code, the strongest taking the rule by right of might, the Badland chieftain's way carried into the conquests of the Golden Order. This duel matters beyond the fortress it won, for it shows the kind of warrior Godfrey was. He did not send his armies to overwhelm the Stormlord. He faced him alone, one warrior against another, staking the outcome on his own strength. This was the way of Hoarah Loux, the Badland chieftain, who ruled by being the strongest, the warrior who proved his right through single combat. Even as the Lord of the Battlefield, the leader of golden armies, Godfrey kept the old code in his heart, the warrior who would face the mightiest foe alone and win the rule by right of strength. The duel with the Stormlord was the Badland chieftain, showing through the Golden Lord the old way of strength deciding the rule. And the victory left its mark on the world that other tales would later touch. By winning Stormvale through his duel, Godfrey became its rightful lord, and his bloodline its rightful heirs. This is part of why his descendant Hoarah Loux, the warrior of his Badland line, would be deemed a valid claimant to Stormvale long after, an heir to the fortress Godfrey had won. The duel with the Storm Lord echoed down the ages, the strength of the First Elden Lord winning a dominion that his blood would have claimed to long after he was gone. The warrior's victory written into the inheritance of his line. Stormvale kept his memory in stone. Long after Godfrey was gone, a statue stood in Stormvale Castle depicting the First Elden Lord and his lion Serosh, the warrior who had won the fortress in single combat, and the beast that rode upon his back. The image of Godfrey and his regent endured in the place his strength had claimed, a monument to the duel that won it, the lord and his lion kept in stone in the fortress that his victory had made his own. Even in the broken later days, when a feeble descendant clung to a fragment of his inheritance, the memory of the founder endured in Stormvale, the warrior king and his beast carved into the halls his strength had won. The duel also shows something about how Godfrey ruled, and it sets him apart from the lords who came after. He won Stormvale through strength rather than through scheme or alliance or inheritance, through facing the Storm Lord alone and proving himself the stronger. This was the old way, the Badland way, where rule was warranted by strength and the strongest took the crown. Godfrey carried this way into the Golden Order, winning his dominions through the strength of his own arm, ruling by right of might in the manner of the chieftain he had always been. The duel with the Storm Lord was the first Elden Lord ruling, as he had always ruled, by strength, the warrior king taking his dominion through single combat in the old code of the Badlands. The Long March. The greatest of Godfrey's later campaigns was a thing remembered as the Long March, a war that carried him far and cost him much. During the siege of Castle Morn on the Weeping Peninsula, Godfrey bested a lone hero who wielded a grafted blade and fought for vengeance. The lord of the battlefield met this vengeful champion and defeated him, another foe fallen before the strength of the First Elden Lord. The siege was one of the many battles of his conquests, another fortress subdued, another enemy broken, the golden armies of Godfrey carving their way across the lands between under the leadership of their warrior king. And there was the Long March itself, a campaign so arduous that it broke even the weapon of the First Elden Lord. During a battle fought in the Long March, the head of Godfrey's great twin-headed axe was broken, the weapon that bore his vow of restraint damaged in the fighting. The axe that symbolized his vow to conduct himself as a lord was broken in the Long March, a mark of how hard the campaign was, how fierce the fighting, how far the warrior king carried his wars. His loyal warriors honored him still, wielding axes of their own in his example. The broken-axed lord leading his faithful band through the long and bitter campaign. Through all these conquests, the golden armies of Godfrey were undefeated. His forces were unvanquished and unbowed, victorious in every campaign, triumphant in every war. The lord of the battlefield led his armies to victory after victory, never broken, never beaten, the strength of the First Elden Lord carrying his golden host through every battle it fought. By the end of his conquests, Godfrey had subdued his enemies, won his wars, built the dominion of the Golden Order through the strength of his arm. His armies stood unvanquished, his conquest complete, his strength proven on every battlefield he had walked. And it was then, with his wars won and his enemies broken, that the strange sorrow came upon him. The broken axe is worth holding on to. for it became a thing of meaning to his warriors and his line. The head of Godfrey's twin-headed axe, shattered in the long march, was never made whole again. And yet, his loyal warriors honoured him still, taking up axes of their own in imitation of their lord, the axe becoming the weapon of choice for the chieftains of the Badlands would later rule. The broken weapon of the First Elden Lord became, through his warriors' devotion, the symbol of a whole people, the axe of Godfrey carried on by those who followed him even after its head was broken. The mark of his vow, damaged in the long march, lived on in the weapons of his faithful, a broken emblem honoured by the warriors who would follow their lord into exile and beyond. There is a detail in this that the law preserves with care. The golden phantom of Godfrey that a Tarnished would later face in the capital wields an unbroken axe, a weapon with both its blades whole, the axe as it was before the Long March broke it. This is the image of Godfrey in his glory, the first Elden Lord before his fall, before the Long March, before the breaking of his weapon and the fading of his grace. The unbroken axe is the memory of the Lord at his height, the warrior king in the fullness of his glory, before the long campaign that broke his weapon and the strange sorrow that broke his purpose. The fading of the light. At the end of all his victories, when there were no more worthy enemies left to fight, something went out of Godfrey, and the law marks it with a quiet and haunting image. When his last worthy enemy fell, it is said that the hue of Godfrey's eyes faded. The light went out of his eyes, the colour drained from them. In the moment his last worthy foe was defeated, the warrior who lived for battle, whose whole nature was the hunger for combat, had run out of enemies worth fighting. He had conquered everything, broken every foe, won every war, and in doing so he had emptied the world of the battles that gave his life meaning. The fading of the light in his eyes was the fading of his purpose, the warrior who had nothing left to fight, the hunger for battle with nothing left to feed it. This is one of the most poignant moments in all of Godfrey's story, and it cuts to the heart of what he was. Godfrey was a warrior, the mightiest who ever lived, a being whose truest self was the lust for battle. And the very completeness of his victories destroyed the thing he lived for. With his last worthy enemy fallen, there were no more battles worth fighting, no more foes worth facing, no more outlet for the hunger that defined him. The Lord of the battlefield had won so wholly that he had abolished the battlefield, conquered himself out of the only purpose he had ever known. The light faded from his eyes because the warrior had nothing left to be. There is a deep irony here, the kind that runs through the whole of Elden Ring. Godfrey's greatness was his strength, his prowess in battle, his power to conquer any foe. And that very greatness was his undoing, for a warrior who can conquer everything will, in the end, run out of things to conquer. The stronger Godfrey was, the faster he emptied the world of worthy enemies. The more thoroughly he won, the sooner there was nothing left to fight. His strength carried within it the seed of his own emptying, the warrior so mighty that his victories consumed his own purpose. The fading of the light in his eyes was the price of his greatness, the warrior undone by the completeness of his own conquests. And there is something in this that speaks to the nature of the warrior's soul. Godfrey did not want a throne, did not want power, did not want to rule a peaceful realm. He wanted the fight, the test of strength, the clash of war that was the meaning of his life. And so victory, total and final victory, was a kind of death to him, the end of the only thing he valued, the silencing of the hunger that was his truest self. A man who lived for peace might have rejoiced to see his wars all won. But Godfrey lived for war. and the end of war was the end of his reason for being, the warrior emptied by the very victory that other men would have called the crown of his life. And this fading was the beginning of his fall. For when his conquests were complete and the light had gone from his eyes, Godfrey found that something else had faded too. His grace, the golden blessing of the Erdtree that marked him as a lord of the Golden Order. Although his golden armies stood unvanquished and unbowed, he found his grace lost, tattered and faded, the blessing of gold draining from him as the light drained from his eyes. The warrior who had won every war was about to lose everything, his purpose gone, his grace fading, the first Elden Lord standing victorious over a conquered world and finding that his victory had emptied him of the very things that made him a lord. What that loss of grace meant and what it cost him is the turn we follow next. Sleep well. Tomorrow we come to the loss of grace, the casting out of the first Elden Lord, and the making of the first Tarnished. When his last worthy enemy fell and the light faded from his eyes, the first Elden Lord lost more than his purpose. He lost his grace, the golden blessing of the Erdtree, and with it his place in the lands between. Marika deprived Godfrey and his warriors of their grace, cast them out of the Golden Realm, and made them the first of the Tarnished, the exiles whose long story would one day bring a champion to the foot of the Erdtree. Tonight we sit with the casting out of the first Elden Lord, the making of the first Tarnished, and the promise that was given to those who were sent away. Tonight we sit with the loss of grace, the exile of the warrior king, and the origin of all the Tarnished. The taking of grace. When Godfrey's conquests were complete and the light had faded from his eyes, the golden blessing that marked him as a lord was taken from him. Although Godfrey's golden armies stood unvanquished and unbowed, he found his grace lost, tattered and faded. The grace of gold, the blessing of the Erdtree that marked the favored of the Golden Order, drained away from the first Elden Lord and his warriors. And this was no accident, no natural fading. Marika herself deprived Godfrey and his warriors of their grace, taking from them the golden blessing, stripping them of their place in the order. The first Elden Lord, the mightiest warrior who ever lived, the founder of the Golden Lineage, was deprived of grace by the very queen who had raised him. The blessing of gold taken from him by the god he had served. To lose grace in the lands between is to lose everything. Grace is the guidance of the Erdtree, the golden blessing that marks one as part of the Golden Order, the favor of the gods made visible. To be deprived of grace is to be cast out, severed from the order, abandoned by the gods, left to wander without the golden guidance that gives life meaning in the lands between. When Marika took Godfrey's grace, she did not just dismiss a servant. She severed him from the golden world entirely, cast him out of the order he had helped to build, left him graceless and abandoned, an exile from the very realm his strength had founded. This is the origin of a word that runs through the whole of Elden Ring, the Tarnished. Those deprived of grace, those abandoned by the Erdtree, those cast out of the Golden Realm, are the Tarnished, the graceless exiles marked by the loss of the golden blessing. And the first of them, the very first of all the Tarnished, was Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, the mightiest warrior who ever lived. The founder of the Golden Lineage became the founder of another line as well, the line of the Tarnished, the graceless exiles whose long story would shape the end of the world. The first Elden Lord was also the first Tarnished, the warrior king cast out of grace. There is a bitter symmetry in this that gives Godfrey's fall its weight. He had been the first to rise, the first Elden Lord, the first consort raised by Marika to her side, lifted from the Badlands to the Golden Throne, and he became the first to fall, the first deprived of grace, the first cast out of the Golden Realm, the being who stood at the very beginning of the Golden Order's glory, its first lord and champion, stood also at the beginning of the Tarnished, its first exile and outcast. Godfrey bookends the story of grace in the lands between, the first to be raised by it, and the first to be cast out of it, the founder of the Golden Line and the founder of the Graceless One. And the player who walks through Elden Ring walks in his footsteps without knowing it. The tarnished hero whom the player guides, the graceless exile called home across the fog to stand before the Erdtree, is a descendant of Godfrey and his warriors, an heir to the first of the Tarnished. Every Tarnished who returns to the lands between, every graceless exile drawn home by the call of their long-lost grace, follows the path that Godfrey's casting out first opened. The first Elden Lord, deprived of grace and exiled to the Badlands, became the root of the whole line that the player belongs to. The first of the Tarnished, whose long story the player lives out at the end of the world. The casting out. With their grace taken, Godfrey and his warriors were sent away from the lands between, exiled to distant lands. After being deprived of their grace, Godfrey and his warriors were banished from the lands between, cast out of the Golden Realm and sent into exile. They were driven from the world Godfrey's strength had conquered, sent away from the dominion they had built, exiled to wander beyond the borders of the lands between. The first Elden Lord, who had led golden armies to victory across the realm, was cast out of that realm, banished with his faithful warriors to distant and foreign lands, and in exile Godfrey became again what he had once been. He returned to the Badlands, the harsh distant country he had come from, and took up again the name he had set aside, Hoarah Loux, the Chieftain of the Badlands. The Lord became the Chieftain once more, the golden name of Godfrey giving way again to the wild name of Hoarah Loux, the warrior king returning to the harsh country of his origin. In a sense, the exile returned him to his truest self, the Badland chieftain he had always been beneath the Golden Lord, sent back to the wild country where strength alone ruled. His warriors went with him, and together they became something new and momentous. Hoarah Loux and his warriors, the exiled lord and his faithful band, became the first Tarnished, and all other Tarnished are descended from them. The whole line of the Tarnished, the graceless exiles whose champion would one day return to claim the throne, traces back to Godfrey and his warriors, the first of the exiled, the founders of the Tarnished line. In the Badlands, cast out of grace, Hoarah Loux and his warriors became the root of all the Tarnished, the origin of the exiles, whose long story would bring a champion back to the lands between at the end of all things. There is a faithfulness in his warriors that deserves marking. They had followed Hoarah Loux when he was raised to lordship, risen with him into the Golden Order, fought under his banner through all his conquests, and when he was cast out, deprived of grace, exiled to the Badlands, they did not abandon him. They went with him into exile, shared his fall as they had shared his rise, followed their chieftain out of the Golden Realm and back into the harsh country of his origin. The Brotherhood of the Badlands held through everything, through the rise to lordship and the fall into exile, the warriors faithful to their chieftain in grace and in gracelessness alike. They had honored him with axes in his glory, and they honored him still in his fall, the faithful band that would one day return with him to the lands between. And in the Badlands, Hoarah Loux ruled again, as he had ruled before, the chieftain of a hard people in a distant land. His warriors honored him by wielding axes of their own, in the old way, the broken-axed lord leading his faithful through the harsh country. The axe became the weapon of choice for the chieftains of the Badlands, the mark of Hoarah Loux carried on by the people he ruled in exile. The First Elden Lord, cast out of the Golden Realm, became once more the chieftain of the Badlands, ruling by strength in the old way. The warrior king returned to the wild country where his story had begun, waiting, with his faithful warriors, for the promise of return to be fulfilled. The promise. The exile of the First Elden Lord was not the end of his story, for with the casting out came a promise. Before Godfrey and his men departed the lands between, Marika made them a promise, that after their deaths they would regain what she had claimed from them, before returning to the lands between to wage war and brandish the Elden Ring. The grace she had taken would be given back, but only through death and trial. The Tarnished would die in their exile, and in dying would regain the grace they had lost, the golden blessing returning to call them home. The casting out was a sending away with a promise of return, rather than a final abandonment. The exiles told that through death they would win back what was taken and come home to the lands between. This promise is the deep engine of the whole story of Elden Ring. The Tarnished were sent away graceless, but promised that they would one day be called back, their long-lost grace returning to guide them home across the fog. They would grow strong in the face of death, hardened by their trials in the exile beyond the lands between, and when the time came, the call of their grace would bring them home to wage war and stand before the Elden Ring. The whole return of the Tarnished, the long journey of the champion to the foot of the Erdtree was promised here, in the words Marika gave to Godfrey and his warriors before they departed. There is a strange mercy and a strange cruelty woven together in this promise. The Tarnished were cast out, deprived of grace, exiled from the Golden Realm, a cruel fate for the warriors who had served the Order. And yet they were promised return, told that through death and trial they would regain what was lost and come home. A mercy held out across the exile. The First Elden Lord and his warriors were sent away with both the cruelty of the casting out and the mercy of the promise, exiled from grace yet held by a thread of hope. The graceless warriors told that one day, through death, they would be called home. Godfrey carried this promise into his exile. The first of the Tarnished, the warrior king, would one day return. The promise also reveals something about the nature of the Tarnished and their purpose. They were to grow strong in the face of death, hardened by their trials in the exile beyond the lands between. The casting out was, in a sense, a forging. The Tarnished sent away to be tempered by death and hardship, to become strong enough for the role they would one day play. The graceless exiles were being made into something, shaped by their trials into the champions who would return to stand before the Elden Ring. The promise was of transformation as much as return. The Tarnished told that they would come home changed, hardened, strengthened by the very exile that had cast them out. For Godfrey, the mightiest warrior who ever lived, this forging carried a particular meaning. He was already the strongest of all mortals, already hardened by a life of war, but in his exile deprived of grace, returned to the Badlands. He would wait through death itself for the promise to be fulfilled, the warrior king holding to the assurance that one day he would be called home to fight again. For a being whose whole nature was the hunger for battle, the promise of return to the lands between, to wage war and brandish the Elden Ring, was a promise of the thing he lived for. More battles, more war, a return to the field that gave his life meaning. The exile that had emptied him of purpose carried within it the promise of purpose restored. The warrior told that through death, he would return to war. The mystery of the exile. There is a question at the heart of all this that the lore leaves open, and it is worth sitting with. Why did Marika cast out her own lord? The lore does not give a single clear answer, and the mystery is part of what makes Godfrey's fall so poignant. Why would the God Queen deprive her own consort, the mightiest warrior who ever lived, the father of her golden lineage, of his grace? Some see it tied to the fading of his eyes, the loss of his purpose, the warrior who had run out of worthy enemies. With his conquest complete, his usefulness to the Order spent, perhaps Godfrey had become something the Golden Order no longer needed. A warrior lord with no more wars to win, cast out when his purpose was done. Others see something deeper in it, tied to Marika's own long and hidden designs. Marika was a being of vast and secret purposes, a god queen who would in time shatter her own order, betray her own creation, work toward ends that few could see. Perhaps the casting out of Godfrey and the making of the Tarnished was part of some long design, a seed planted for an age yet to come. The Tarnished, after all, would be the ones who returned at the end to stand before the Elden Ring, and Marika's promise to them shaped the whole endgame of the world. Perhaps in casting out Godfrey, Marika was founding the line that would one day bring about the end she sought, rather than merely dismissing a spent warrior. There is a reading in which the whole of Elden Ring turns on this moment. Marika would, in the end, seek to break the Golden Order, to undo the very world she had built, for reasons tied to her own buried grief and hidden purpose. And the instrument of that undoing would be the Tarnished, the graceless exiles called home to stand before the Elden Ring and decide the fate of the world. If Marika foresaw this, if the casting out of Godfrey was the first move in a long game whose end was the breaking of her own order, then Godfrey's exile was the seed of everything that came after. The first Elden Lord cast out of grace became the founder of the line that would one day return to remake or destroy the world the God Queen had made. We cannot know for certain. The lore holds its silence on Marika's deepest reasons, as it holds its silence on so much. But whatever drove her, the result is clear. The first Elden Lord, the mightiest of mortals, the founder of the Golden Lineage, was cast out of grace and made the first of the Tarnished, and from that casting out flowed the whole long story of the exiles and their return. Godfrey's fall was a beginning as much as an ending, the close of his glory and the opening of the Tarnished line. The warrior king sent into exile carrying the promise that would one day bring his kind home to the lands between. Whatever the reason, the casting out of Godfrey marks one of the great turns in the history of the lands between. The first Elden Lord, the mightiest of mortals, the founder of the Golden Lineage, was deprived of grace and sent into exile, and in his exile became the first of the Tarnished, the root of the line whose champion would one day return. The warrior king who had founded the Golden Age was cast out of it, sent away to the Badlands, made the first of the graceless exiles. And he carried with him the promise of return, the thread of hope across the exile, the assurance that one day, through death, the Tarnished would be called home. What became of that promise, and how Godfrey returned, is the story still to come. Sleep well. Tomorrow we follow the long-lost grace as it calls the Tarnished home, and watch the First Elden Lord return to the lands between at last. The promise made to the first Tarnished was that they would one day be called home, and in time, that day came. After long ages in exile, after death itself, the long-lost grace of the Tarnished stirred and called them back across the fog to the lands between. The world they returned to was a broken one, shattered by the grief and rage of the God Queen who had cast them out. Tonight we follow the call of grace as it brings the Tarnished home, and watch the First Elden Lord return at last to the realm that had exiled him, drawn back by the promise made so long ago. Tonight we sit with the return of the First Elden Lord, the call of grace across the fog, and the broken world that waited for him. The death of the Chieftain. Before the return could come, the First Elden Lord had to pass through death, as the promise required. At some point in his long exile, Hoarah Loux died. The mightiest warrior who ever lived, the First Elden Lord, the Chieftain of the Badlands, came at last to his death in the distant country of his exile. This was the death that the promise required, the passing through which the Tarnished would regain what had been taken from them. Hoarah Loux died in the Badlands, far from the golden realm that had cast him out, the warrior king meeting his end in the harsh country where his story had begun, and to which his exile had returned him. But for the Tarnished, death was not the end. The promise Marika had made was that through death, the exiles would regain their grace and return to the lands between. Death, for the Tarnished, was a doorway rather than an ending, the passage through which the long-lost grace would call them home. Hoarah Loux died, as all the Tarnished would die in their exile, but his death was the threshold of his return, the passing through which the promise would be fulfilled. The warrior king who had died in the Badlands would not stay dead, for the grace that had been taken from him would one day call him back across the fog. This is the strange condition of the Tarnished, woven into the promise that defined them. They were the exiles who had to die to come home, the graceless warriors whose death was the price and the doorway of their return. Hoarah Loux passed through this doorway, died in his exile as the promise required, and waited in death for the call of grace that would bring him home. The First Elden Lord, who had founded the Golden Age and been cast out of it, lay dead in the Badlands, waiting for the promise of return to be fulfilled. The warrior king held in death until the day his grace would call him back. There is something fitting in the warrior king dying in the Badlands, the country of his origin. Hoarah Loux had begun in the Badlands, the wild chieftain of a hard people, before Marika raised him to lordship. And he ended there too, in his exile, the Lord cast out of the Golden Realm, returning to the wild country to die. His story came full circle in the Badlands, the chieftain raised from them to godhood and lordship, then cast back down into them, dying at last in the harsh country where he had begun. The First Elden Lord, who had climbed from the Badlands to the Golden Throne, returned to the Badlands to die, the warrior king ending where he had started, in the wild country of his origin. And his faithful warriors died with him, as they had lived with him, the first Tarnished passing through death together. The band that had followed Hoarah Loux from the Badlands to lordship and back into exile died in the Badlands as their chieftain died, the whole brotherhood of the first Tarnished passing through the doorway of death toward the promise of return. They had shared his rise and his fall, his glory and his exile, and now they shared his death, the faithful warriors dying alongside their chieftain, all of them waiting in death for the grace that would call them home. The first Tarnished died together in the Badlands, the brotherhood unbroken even in death, waiting as one for the promise of return. the shattering. The world that the Tarnished would return to had been broken in their absence, shattered by the grief and rage of the God Queen. After the death of Godwyn the Golden, the beloved Golden Son, something broke in Marika. The murder of her favourite child, the first demigod to die, drove the God Queen to the brink, and in her grief and rage, Marika shattered the Elden Ring, breaking the very heart of the Golden Order, the sacred ring that bound the world together. The shattering of the Elden Ring was the great catastrophe of the lands between, the breaking of the order Marika had built, the act that plunged the realm into the chaos and war that other tales have followed. When the Elden Ring shattered, its great runes scattered among Marika's demigod children, the shards of the ring becoming the prizes over which the demigods would war. The shattering, as it came to be called, was a war of the demigods, the children of Marika and Radagon, fighting one another for the shards of the broken ring. The Golden Lineage and its kin tearing the realm apart in their struggle for the pieces of the Elden Ring. The Golden Age that Godfrey's strength had founded collapsed into civil war. The demigods warring, the realm breaking, the order that the First Elden Lord had helped to build descending into ruin. It was this broken world that the Tarnished would return to. The lands between of the shattering was a realm in ruin, its order broken, its demigods warring, its golden age collapsed into chaos and blood. The world Godfrey had conquered and built, the dominion of the Golden Order, lay shattered, its sacred ring broken, its realm torn by the wars of the demigods. And into this broken world the Tarnished would be called, the graceless exiles returning to a realm that had ruined itself in their absence, drawn home to stand before the broken Elden Ring at the end of the Golden Age. There is a bitter completeness to the ruin that awaited Godfrey's return. The Golden Age he had founded with the breaking of the giants, the order his strength had built, the lineage his blood had begun. All of it had fallen into ruin in his absence. His beloved son Godwyn was dead, murdered in the dark. His cursed sons, Morgoth and Mog, were shunned and turned, one guarding a dying capital and one lost to a god of blood. The Elden Ring was shattered, the order broken, the realm at war. Everything Godfrey had built and fathered had come to ruin while he walked his exile in the Badlands. The Golden Age, collapsing into the chaos, would return to find. And at the center of that ruin was the God Queen who had made it, the queen who had raised Godfrey and cast him out. Marika, in her grief over Godwyn, had shattered her own order, broken the world she had built, plunged the realm into the chaos of the shattering. The queen, who had summoned Godfrey from the Badlands, raised him to lordship, given him the Golden Lineage, and then stripped him of grace and exiled him, had now broken the whole order they had built together. The world Godfrey returned to was the wreckage of Marika's own undoing, the Golden Age she had founded and then shattered, the realm she had built and then broken in her grief. Into this wreckage, the First Elden Lord came home, returning to the ruin of everything he and the God Queen had made. The Call of Grace. With the Elden Ring shattered and the realm in ruin, the long-lost grace of the Tarnished stirred at last and called them home. When the Elden Ring was shattered following the death of Godwyn the Golden, the Tarnished, who had died outside the lands between, were returned to life by the call of their long-lost grace. The promise was fulfilled. The grace that Marika had taken from Godfrey and his warriors returned, calling the dead exiles back to life, summoning them home across the fog to the lands between. The long-lost grace, the golden blessing that had been stripped away in the casting out, stirred again and called the Tarnished home. fulfilling the promise made so long ago before the exiles had departed. This was the promise Marika had made before Godfrey and his men had departed the lands between, that after their deaths they would regain what she had claimed from them, before returning to the lands between to wage war and brandish the Elden Ring. Now that promise came true. The Tarnished, who had died in their exile, were called back by their returning grace, summoned home to the broken realm to wage war over the shattered ring. The grace that had been taken was given back. The exiles called home. The promise of return fulfilled at last after the long ages of exile and death. And the Tarnished who returned were changed from the warriors who had left, grown strong in the face of death, hardened by their trials in the exile beyond the lands between, tempered by the death they had passed through. The exiles who returned were forged by their long ordeal, made strong by death and hardship, the graceless warriors who came home stronger than they had departed. The Tarnished crossed the fog and returned to the lands between, hardened and strong, to stand before the Elden Ring and contend for the right to become Elden Lord. The exiles called home to decide the fate of the broken realm. The once and future king. There is a deep resonance in this return, one that connects to the myth woven through Godfrey from the beginning, the legend of the king who returns. We saw, in the first part, the echo of Arthur in Godfrey, the great warrior who presided over a lost golden age and was sent away from his realm. The king prophesied to return one day to reclaim his rule. The return of the Tarnished, and of Godfrey among them, fulfills that echo. The first Elden Lord, who had founded the Golden Age and been exiled from it, was promised that he would come home, and now the promise was kept. The king, who had been sent away, returned, drawn back across the fog to the realm that had cast him out, the once and future king coming home at the end of the age. The Tarnished as a whole carry this Arthurian shape, and their gathering place makes it plain. The Round Table Hold, where the Tarnished assemble in their quest to become Elden Lord, echoes the Round Table of Arthur's knights, the gathering of champions bound to a great purpose. The Tarnished are the returned, the exiles called home to contend for the throne, the heirs of the first Elden Lord gathered like knights around a table at the end of the world. Godfrey, the first of them, stands behind this whole image, the founding king whose exile and promised return shape the legend that the Tarnished live out, and there is a poignancy in the form the return takes. Arthur was promised to return to save his people, to reclaim his rule, to restore the lost Golden Age. Godfrey returns to a broken world, a shattered realm, an ashen capital, to fight one last time for the crown, rather than to restore the Golden Age, to be granted audience once more, to test his strength against the champion who would claim the throne. The once and future king comes home to a ruined kingdom, rather than a restored one, to fight his last battle at the end of the Golden Age, rather than to reclaim it. The promise of return is kept, but the realm he returns to is broken, the king coming home to ashes rather than to glory. The Lord returns. Among the Tarnished called home across the fog was the first of them all, the first Elden Lord, returning to the realm that had exiled him. Godfrey was among those who made their way back to the lands between. The first Elden Lord, the first of the Tarnished, the warrior king who had died in his exile, was called home by the returning grace, crossing the fog to the broken realm he had once ruled. He returned to the lands between after his long exile and his death, drawn back by the promise made so long ago, the first Elden Lord coming home at last to the golden realm that had cast him out, the warrior king who had founded the Golden Age, been exiled from it, and died in the Badlands, returned to the lands between to take up his place in the endgame of the world. And he returned to a particular place, heavy with meaning for him. Godfrey made his way to Leyndell, the royal capital, the golden city at the heart of the realm he had once ruled. There, at the Elden Throne, he would take up his station, the First Elden Lord returning to the seat of the order he had founded. But the Leyndell he returned to was a broken thing. The ashen capital, the golden city fallen into ruin, the heart of the shattered realm. The warrior king came home to a capital in ashes, the golden city of his glory reduced to a ruined seat at the end of the world. There is a weight to this return that the final part will carry. Godfrey came home as a Tarnished, one of the exiles called back to contend for the throne, returning to the realm that had cast him out to stand once more before the Elden Ring. He came to fight, to take up his strength again, to be granted audience once more, the warrior king returning to claim the place that had been taken from him. And he came home to grief, for at the Elden Throne he would find the body of his son Morgott, the Omen King, slain by the very Tarnished champion who would face him. The First Elden Lord returned to the lands between to fight his last battle, to mourn his cursed son, and to meet, at the last, the champion who would prove worthy of the crown. What happened at the Ashen Capital in the final return of the First Elden Lord is the story we close with. It is worth holding the image of Godfrey at his return, for it captures everything he was. He came home still bearing Serosh, the beast upon his back, the lion that had chained his wildness through all his lordship, the restraint he had carried since he first took the crown. He came home in the armor of the Elden Lord, the Golden Lord he had become, the persona laid over the wild chieftain, and he came home with the hunger for battle still burning beneath it all, the warrior who lived for the fight, returning to a broken world for one last war. The First Elden Lord at his return was all his selves at once, the Golden Lord, the chained warrior, the wild chieftain beneath, the first of the Tarnished come home to fight. And the place of his return, the Ashen Capital, mirrors what had become of his world. Leyndell, the golden city he had once ruled, the seat of the order he had founded, was fallen into ash and ruin, the capital of a shattered realm. The warrior king came home to the ruin of his own glory, the golden city of his lordship reduced to a burnt and broken seat. The contrast measures the whole tragedy of the Golden Age. The Lord who had founded it returning to its ashes, the First Elden Lord coming home to the ruined capital of the order his strength had built, the glory he had won fallen into the ash he returned to. Sleep well. Tomorrow, in the final part, the First Elden Lord fights his last battle, sheds the beast from his back, and becomes Hoarah Loux once more. The First Elden Lord came home to fight his last battle. At the foot of the Elden Throne, in the ashen ruin of the capital he had once ruled, Godfrey took up his strength one final time, against the Tarnished champion who had cut a path to the heart of the world. And in that last battle, the thing he had suppressed for the whole of his lordship broke free at last. He tore the beast from his back, cast off the restraint of ages, and became Hoarah Loux once more, the wild warrior unchained. Tonight, in this final part, we sit with the last battle of the First Elden Lord, the shedding of the beast, and the freeing, at the very end, of the warrior beneath the crown. Tonight, in this final part, we sit with Hoarah Loux, warrior, unchained at last. At the Elden Throne. When the Tarnished champion reached the Elden Throne at the heart of the Ashen Capital, they found the First Elden Lord waiting and grieving. After the Tarnished had claimed the great runes, burned the Erdtree, and unbound the rune of death, they returned to Leyndell, now the Ashen capital, and climbed to the Elden Throne. There they found Godfrey, Serosh upon his back, cradling the body of his son Morgoth, the Omen King, whom the Tarnished had slain. The First Elden Lord knelt at the throne, holding the body of his cursed son as it dissipated into golden dust, mourning the Omen child the Golden Order had thrown away. The mighty warrior, the lord of the battlefield, was found at the last in grief, holding his dead son, the father mourning the child the world had shunned. His first words were for Morgoth, and they carry the whole weight of a father's love for a son the Order had cursed. "It has been a long while, Morgoth," he said. "Long and hard didst thou fight." The First Elden Lord spoke to his dead son with tenderness and respect, honouring the loyalty and the long struggle of the Omen child who had guarded the capital to the last. There is no contempt in these words, no shame at the cursed son, only a father's grief and a warrior's respect for another warrior who had fought long and hard. Godfrey mourned Morgoth as a father mourns a son and as a warrior honours a warrior, the tenderness of the First Elden Lord for his shunned child shining through at the very end. This moment, brief as it is, tells us more about Godfrey's heart than all his conquests. Morgoth was an omen, cursed with horns, cast into the sewers, shunned by the Golden Order Godfrey had helped to build. The Order had thrown this child away, hidden him in the dark, deemed him a shame upon the lineage, and yet his father, returning at the end of all things, knelt at the throne to cradle his body and mourn him, speaking to the dead Omen King with love and respect. Whatever the Golden Order decreed about the Omen, whatever shame it heaped upon the cursed twins, Godfrey loved his son, grieved for him, honoured the long, hard fight he had fought. The First Elden Lord's grief for Morgoth is the proof that beneath the Lord and the warrior there was also a father, one who loved the children the world had cursed. Then he turned to the Tarnished, and his bearing changed from grief to challenge. "Tarnished warrior," he said, "spurned by the grace of gold, be assured the Elden Ring resteth close at hand." And then the words that announce his last stand: "Alas, I am returned, to be granted audience once more, upon my name as Godfrey, the First Elden Lord." The warrior king rose from his grief, set aside the body of his son, and took up his strength one final time, the First Elden Lord declaring his return, his intent to be granted audience once more, his readiness to fight the champion who stood before him. The last battle of the First Elden Lord was about to begin. The first phase. In the first phase of the battle, Godfrey fought as the lord he had become, with the beast still upon his back. Godfrey fought the Tarnished as the Elden Lord, wielding his great axe, Serosh riding upon his shoulders. He brought the strength of the Lord of the battlefield to bear, his axe blows and his earth-shaking stomps, the power of the First Elden Lord set against the champion who had come for the throne. This was Godfrey the Lord, the dignified warrior king, fighting with the restraint that Serosh imposed, the beast upon his back still holding down the fullness of his wild nature. For all his might, this was the chained Godfrey, the Lord, and not yet the warrior, fighting with the beast that suppressed his truest self, still bound to his shoulders. Serosh did his work, even in this last battle. The lion sank his teeth into Godfrey's shoulder as they fought, suppressing his lord's bloodlust, holding down the wild warrior even now, keeping Godfrey to the dignified fighting of a lord. The beast that had chained Godfrey's nature through all his lordship chained it still in his final battle. The lion riding his back, biting his shoulder, holding down the hunger for battle that strained beneath. Godfrey fought as a lord, because Serosh made him fight as a lord, the restraint of ages still binding the warrior even in his last stand. But the Tarnished was strong enough to push the First Elden Lord past the point where restraint could hold. As the battle wore on and Godfrey was driven back, the Chained Lord reached the limit of what the bound warrior could do. The Tarnished proved mighty enough to overpower Godfrey the Lord, to push him past the fighting of a dignified king, to force him toward the thing he had suppressed for the whole of his lordship. And at that limit, with the Lord overpowered and the champion proving worthy, Godfrey made the choice that defines his whole story. He cast off the restraint and became himself. The shedding of the beast. At the turning of the battle, the First Elden Lord did the thing he had not done in all his ages of lordship. He freed the warrior beneath the crown. Overpowered as the Lord, Godfrey reached back, grabbed the head of Serosh, and spoke his farewell to the beast that had chained him. That will be all. Thou didst me good service, Serosh. I have given thee courtesy enough. And then he tore the lion from his back. With a roar, he ripped away the beast that had suppressed his bloodlust through all his lordship, casting off the restraint of ages, freeing the wild warrior that had been chained beneath the crown. Drenched in the blood of his loyal regent, the First Elden Lord cast aside the lord he had become and took up the warrior he had always been. Now I fight as Hoarah Loux, he declared. The Lord was gone. The name of Godfrey, the persona of the dignified Elden Lord, was cast aside with the beast, and the wild chieftain of the Badlands stood free at last. Hoarah Loux, the warrior, the truest self that the crown had suppressed, was unchained, fighting now without restraint, without the beast, without the mask of the Lord. The second phase of the battle was Hoarah Loux unbound, the wild warrior freed from the chains of his lordship, fighting with the fullness of the nature he had suppressed for so long. And the change was total. Hoarah Loux cast aside his axe, the weapon of his vow, and fought with his bare hands, grappling, wrestling, striking with the raw and savage strength of the Badland chieftain. The dignified axework of the Lord gave way to the brutal grappling of the warrior, the restraint of Godfrey replaced by the wild fury of Hoarah Loux. He fought now as he had fought in the Badlands, before the crown, before the beast, before the vow, the wild warrior unchained at last, the truest self freed in the final battle of his life. After all his ages of suppression, all his lordship spent holding down his nature, Hoarah Loux fought one last time as himself, free. Thy strength befits a crown. For all the fury of the unchained warrior, the Tarnished proved the stronger, and the First Elden Lord met his end. Hoarah Loux fought with everything he was, the wild warrior unbound, grappling and striking with the savage strength of the Badlands. But the Tarnished champion, hardened by death and trial, strengthened by the long ordeal of exile and return, proved mightier still. The champion overcame even Hoarah Loux unchained, even the wild warrior at the fullness of his freed strength, defeating the First Elden Lord in his final battle. The mightiest mortal who ever lived, the First Elden Lord, the wild chieftain freed at last, fell before the Tarnished champion who had come for the throne. And in his defeat, Hoarah Loux did a thing that reveals the whole of his warrior's soul. He approved. Brave Tarnished, he said, thy strength befits a crown. And then he laughed, heartily, in his defeat. There was no bitterness in his end, no rage at being beaten, only the joy of a warrior who had found at last a foe worthy of him. A crown is warranted with strength, he had said, the old code of the Badlands where the strongest is the rightful ruler. and the Tarnished had proven the stronger, had earned the crown by right of might, in the old way that Hoarah Loux had always honoured. The First Elden Lord died approving of the one who beat him, laughing in his defeat, glad to have found a worthy foe at the last. This ending is the truest expression of who Hoarah Loux was. He lived for battle, for the test of strength against strength, for the clash of war that was the meaning of his life. And in his final battle, freed of the beast, fighting as himself, he found a worthy foe at last, a champion strong enough to beat him, and he rejoiced in it even in defeat. The fading of his eyes so long ago had come from running out of worthy enemies, and here, at the very end, he found one, the Tarnished strong enough to overcome even Hoarah Loux unchained. The First Elden Lord died as a warrior would wish to die, beaten by a worthy foe, his strength tested to the last, laughing in his defeat because a crown is warranted with strength, and the Tarnished had proven worthy of the crown. The freeing of the warrior. There is a meaning in this ending that gathers up the whole of Godfrey's story, and it is worth sitting with as we near the close. The whole of Godfrey's life was a suppression. He had been a wild warrior, the mightiest of mortals, a being whose truest self was the hunger for battle. And to become a lord, he had chained that self, taken a new name, bound a beast to his back, made a vow of restraint, suppressed his wild nature for the whole of his lordship. He had lived as Godfrey, the dignified lord, while Hoarah Loux, the wild warrior, waited beneath, suppressed, diminished, held down by the beast and the vow and the crown. Godfrey's life was a long act of self-suppression, the warrior buried so that the Lord could rule, and his death was a liberation. In his final battle, overpowered as the Lord, Godfrey tore away the beast, cast off the restraint, and became Hoarah Loux once more, the wild warrior freed at last. The suppression of ages was undone in a single act, the chains cast off, the truest self unbound. Godfrey died as Hoarah Loux, the warrior freed from the Lord, the wild chieftain liberated at the very end from the crown that had bound him. His death was the freeing of the self he had suppressed for so long, the warrior unchained at last, fighting one final time as his true self. There is both tragedy and triumph in this. The tragedy is that Hoarah Loux could only be free in his final battle, that the whole of his lordship was a suppression of his truest self, that he had to die to be unchained. But the triumph is that he was unchained, that at the very end he cast off the beast and the crown and fought as himself, free, joyful, a worthy foe found at last. The First Elden Lord spent his life as a chained lord and died as a free warrior, and in that death there is a kind of release, the wild heart freed at the end from the long suppression of the crown. Hoarah Loux died as himself, unbound, and there is a strange joy in that, the warrior free at last. What Godfrey means. So we come to the end, and to the meaning of the First Elden Lord, the warrior king, Godfrey, Hoarah Loux. He was the mightiest of mortals, the wild chieftain of the Badlands, the strongest being who ever lived that was not already a god. He was raised by Marika to be her first consort, the First Elden Lord, the father of the Golden Lineage, and to wear that crown he chained his wild nature, took a new name, bound a beast to his back, suppressed the warrior so that the Lord could rule. He won the war against the giants and birthed the Erdtree, fathered the Golden Lineage and the cursed Omen twins, conquered the realm as the lord of the battlefield, and then, his enemies all broken and the light faded from his eyes, was cast out of grace and made the first of the Tarnished. He died in his exile, was called home by the promise of return, and came back to fight one last battle at the foot of the throne, where he shed the beast at last and died as Hoarah Loux, the warrior freed. That is the heart of what Godfrey means, the tension between the wild warrior and the dignified lord, the truest self and the role, the hunger for battle and the restraint of the crown. Godfrey is the being who suppressed himself for the sake of an order, who chained his nature out of devotion and a given word, who lived a long act of self-diminishment and died in a single act of liberation. He is the warrior who became a lord and paid for it with the fullness of himself, and who, at the very end, took himself back, casting off the crown to die as the wild warrior he had always been beneath it. And there is a deep humanity in his story, for all that he is a demigod and a myth. Godfrey is the figure who gives up the fullness of himself for a role, who buries his truest nature out of duty, who lives as a lesser version of himself for the sake of something he is committed to. Many know that suppression, the chaining of the wild heart for the sake of a part one has agreed to play. And many would wish, as Godfrey found at the last, for the moment of casting it off, of being unchained, of fighting one final time as oneself, free. The first Elden Lord is the warrior who was chained and freed, the wild heart suppressed, and at last released, the Lord who died as the warrior he had always been. This has been the entire timeline of Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, the Lord of the battlefield, Hoarah Loux, the mightiest of mortals raised to lordship and godhood, the warrior who chained himself to wear a crown, the father of the Golden Lineage, the conqueror of the giants, the first of the Tarnished, the once and future king who came home to fight one last battle, and who, at the very end, tore away the beast and the crown and died as Hoarah Loux, the wild warrior, free at last, laughing in his defeat because a worthy foe had been found, because a crown is warranted with strength, because the warrior beneath the Lord was unchained at the last, told slowly. For the quiet between waking and whatever waits in the dark, good night, my friend.